tonight. We are very, very lucky to be joined by Professor Pip Moore. So, Pip is a Director of Education, the Deputy Head of School of Natural and Environmental Sciences, and a Professor of Marine Ecology as well. So, we are in expert hands this evening. Pip is going to be talking a little bit to us this evening about kelp.
Yeah, I apologize for the large number of titles I have. People seem to think that I'm a leader. I just really like kelp forests, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, Blair, thank you for inviting me to give this webinar. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit just about kelp forests in the UK. They're this sort of our hidden broadleaf forests underneath the sea. And this is an image of a UK kelp forest with a few seals in there just to get the fluffy lovers to realise how important um, kelp forests are. Many of you may have watched the David Attenborough show, the Wild Isles show, and it started off with a scene of orcas chasing seals, and where while most people were getting excited about the fact that there was orcas around the Shetlands, I was getting more excited that the orcas were hunting the seals in kelp forests. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is going to spend the first half of the talk just talking a little bit about the sort of importance of kelp forests in general, a little bit about kelp forests in the UK, before focusing in towards the back end of the talk about some of the work that we've been doing as part of the Stronger Shores project in terms of looking at a key ecosystem service provided by kelp. So this image here is an image that some of you may have seen on various life history documentaries. So this is an image of giant kelp in Monterey Bay in California, and this rather cute image of a sea otter curled up around the kelp sort of being anchored to the seafloor. And I think for a lot of people, when they think about these really sort of huge kelp forest environments, they don't think that we have them right off our coastline in the UK. So this is an image taken off Orkney Island. It's actually off the island of Hoy, where the Old Man of Hoy is. And this is a pinnacle called Nipple Rock. It goes down to about 50 meters. In this image, we're in about 15 meters of water. And what we can see is a kelp forest that's supporting a really wide diversity of a range of organisms. Dead man fingers at the front of the image, which are a type of soft coral. And towards the back of the image, you can see lots of fish that are probably safe in this image. They're also really dynamic systems. So this is an image of a kelp forest from the Shetland Isles. That's sort of bubbling at the top that looks like clouds. That's actually the water movement. And you can see the sort of, even though this is a still image, the sort of power of the waves in this environment. What we would argue, those of us who love kelp forests, is that kelp forests are the equivalent of our broadleaf forests that we find in our terrestrial systems. They create a three-dimensional habitat that supports a really high diversity of organisms. I'm just going to quickly take my jumper off in a seamless manner. Just to give a bit of technical information, not going too deep, because I'm actually not that good, I'm a bit of a bucket and spade ecologist, is that when we're talking about kelp, we're really talking about any large brown canopy forming species. So that's primarily made up of a genre that we find around our coastlines, which is laminarial, which are in the family Laminarials. We also have things like Sacchariza, and in the southern hemisphere, some of the fucals like Davilia. If you're a purist, the true kelps are the order Laminarials, but I'm not really actually that interested in seaweed and seaweed biology. I'm interested in kelp forests because I'm a community ecologist and I'm really interested in the sort of habitat they provide for a wide range of species. So I'm more interested in this large three-dimensional structure that they create. They have a biphasic life cycle, which means that they have two stages, a microscopic gametophyte stage and a macroscopic sporophyte stage. So all of these images you can see of kelp forest, that's their sporophyte, which is their macroscopic stage. And kelp are just distributed around a vast area of the coastline, particularly around cool, temperate into Arctic conditions. You can see some areas where they extend further towards the tropics along these western boundary currents, where you've got upwelling, which brings up cool, nutrient-rich waters. But really, where you find kelp forests are in these sort of temperate environments, such as the United Kingdom, North America, Southern Australia, South Africa, and Southern America. And the reason that I'm particularly interested in kelp forests is they're just incredibly productive environments. They're really, really good at taking carbon dioxide from the water and converting that into biomass, which is then consumed by a wide range of organisms. So at the top of this image is my second favorite limpet. This is the blue-rayed limpet Patella pellucida that directly grazes on kelp. But actually, most of the kelp material isn't grazed when the plant is alive, but it's grazed, it's detritus that is grazed. So you'll probably see my Springer Spaniel Sphagnum appear in a few photos. As a proper scientist, I always need scale in my photos. So this is a huge amount of kelp that's been washed up onto the Northumberland coastline. And if any of you take walks along the coastline, particularly during winter, you'll see large deposits such as this. And this, if you're a weirdo like me, you might go digging around in this, and this is full of small invertebrates that are then consumed by a wide range of organisms, including a lot of our overwintering seabirds that actually rely on this high protein invertebrates to keep them alive over the winter. And as I've said, there's very little of this kelp production that's directly consumed by crazers, but you've got sea urchins, you've got this blue-rayed limpet, and this rather lovely little gastropod, Lacuna vincta, that graze on them directly. But what most of the sort of biomass that is the tissue of kelp is actually consumed via detrital pathways. So this material is lost into the marine environment either through whole plant dislodgement in storms or through just sort of erosional processes. And what we can see here is that a lot of our marine vegetated habitats, so seagrass and salt marsh, also most of the material is consumed as detrital material. But about 80% of that productivity, that turning that carbon dioxide into biomass, is lost as detritus. And some of that is consumed by a suite of grazers and herbivores. Some of that is exported to other habitats. So again, this is sphagnum acting as scale again on the Northumberland coastline. But also in the image below, we can see that through the activities of currents and winds, offshore transport, is this material can be actually taken quite some distance away. And indeed, you found seaweed and kelp fragments in waters over 1,000 meters deep and up to 500 kilometers away from the nearest source. And this material is utilized by a range of different organisms. But increasingly, we're becoming interested in the role that kelp forests might play in carbon sequestration. So this material, this carbon in the tissue being moved offshore where it's buried for 100 years or more, and therefore can assist in climate change mitigation. And all of this comes from the fact that it's really good at turning using the energy of the sun and turning that into biomass. And because of this, because of the three-dimensional structure they create, because of the high levels of productivity, is that they support really high levels of biodiversity. So in this image, at the front of it in the red is some beautiful red algae. The white images are dead man's fingers, soft corals. You've got some jewel anemones and you've got some hydroids. And if we were to actually really investigate those different habitats, we would find a really wide range of invertebrates that are using this sort of habitat for food or shelter. Through developing this three-dimensional habitat, they create a habitat, they also alter the environmental conditions. And this leads to a rich understory of algal assemblages that, as I've shown in that previous photo, support really high species diversity in terms of the invertebrates that you find within them. You also have species of ecological importance, so sea urchins, which you can see in this middle figure. These can be quite important and can actually, not so much in the UK, but can have quite a destructive role in other parts of the world. They also support species of economic importance, such as crabs and lobsters. They provide habitat for fish, including nursery habitat for commercially important species. So I've got an undergraduate student going through some video analysis that we did a couple of years ago around the Farne Islands. And it's really quite exciting to see how many juvenile cod she's been picking up in amongst the kelp forest there. And if you've got all of these fish and other things in there, it attracts higher order predators such as otters, seals, and seabirds. And as seen in the wild, I'll show the orcas around the kelp forest chasing after the seals. And so what this means is kelp forests are comparable to coral reefs in terms of their ecological and economic importance. But I would probably argue that fewer people are aware of this habitat and the role that they play. Um, so in terms of supporting high levels of diversity, part of that is because of the sort of structure that kelp forests have. So they're made up of sort of three structures. They're made up of what's called the holdfast, but if you want to make it analogous to a terrestrial forest, this would be like its root structure. But because kelp grows on rocky shores, these roots don't go into the soil, they attach themselves to the rock. And in amongst all of these, they have little sort of channels and gullies that create habitat for a range of organisms. So they can support 30 to 70 different species and animals on average, but up to 90 species can be found within them. And this image below gives an indication of some of the things that you might find in these holdfasts. So you've got things like crabs, sea urchins, starfish. You've got small gastropods. Sometimes you even find a fish inside the holdfast. In terms of the holdfast, that can actually hold up to 10,000 individuals, but this varies greatly between the type of species and the habitat. So on the right-hand side here, you can see a range of different species and the holdfast that they possess. So you've got something like the giant kelp here that's got an absolutely huge holdfast. We've got Laminaria ochroluca up here, which is very similar to Laminaria hyperborea and produces a habitat for a wide range of organisms. And you've got something like down here, like Davilia antarctica that you find in New Zealand on really, really wave exposed shores. And that holdfast is really heavily cemented to the rocks. So there's probably not a lot of habitat there. Then in the kelp, you also have the stipe, and that's sort of analogous to the trunk in a tree. And this can be a simple, rigid structure that holds the blade into the water and can vary by, a few centimeters to 30 meters or more in some of the giant species like the giant kelp or the bull kelp that you find on the Pacific coasts. Some of these can support really high levels of diversity. So this top image is from a UK kelp, that's Laminaria hyperborea. It has a really ridged and dimpled stipe that creates a suitable habitat that allows lots of algae to actually settle on that. And then that algae provides food and a home for a whole range of species. So there's some evidence that up to 80 species of plant and animals can be found on stipes. And this was from a Norwegian kelp, which was Laminaria hyperborea, where it was found that 55,000 individuals was just on a single stipe. I don't think I would have been wanting to be the person to count them on that day. The lamina or blade has a large surface area for photosynthesis, and that generally supports the least amount of diversity because you don't really want lots of things colonizing the part of you that you want to be gaining as much energy. But you do have some species such as the blue-rayed limpet, some bryozoans, and some epiflora. So these are really important habitats for supporting high. So kelp in itself also supports high levels of diversity, not just the three-dimensional structure that it creates. They also provide a range of ecosystem goods, such as fisheries. So you've got lots of evidence that crabs and lobsters preferentially found within kelp forests and often along coastal stretches. You can see that fishermen put their string of pots out adjacent to kelp forests. And this bottom image is an image taken from a Norwegian kelp forest, and all of those fish in there are cod. And at the back of the image, you might be able to see a diver acting as scales. So that they can provide a huge amount of commercially important species as well. What I'm going to talk about a lot more towards the end of this talk is the role that the kelp forest might play in terms of biogenic coastal defence, so protecting our coastlines from increased storminess. This is an image of an exceptionally low tide Orkney. This species you wouldn't normally see exposed to here, but I think it was like a minus zero point 0.5 or something like that. It was absolutely bonkers. But you can see that this extends over hundreds of meters. And because of this sort of three-dimensional habitat is it creates a level of roughness that slows the water motion and therefore protects our coastlines. And just to bring another fluffy in, we also know our kelp forests bring a whole load of cultural services via tourism and also just a general sense of well-being of being in nature. So if any of you are divers and have dived up at the Farne Islands over a weekend, they will invariably throw you into a kelp forest because that's where the seals are, and they'll come up and nibble your fins or nibble your nose or what have you, and you have a really good diving experience. There's also evidence to suggest that actually kelp forests were really instrumental in the colonization of the Americas. There's various hypotheses put forward for how the Americas were colonized, but there's increasing evidence that the maritime route was actually a particularly important corridor. And in following that maritime route there's really abundant kelp forests along that coastline. And the idea being is there was plentiful food, so people were healthy and were able to extend their ranges through the Americas. What we do know is that kelp forests cover about 33% of coastlines globally, and they're the dominant marine vegetated habitat among many temperate reef coastlines. I don't want you to focus too much on the detail on the right-hand side of this, but this is ecosystem services can generally be split into four different types of services. So provisioning, so that is sort of the provision of raw materials or fisheries. Regulating, so that could be absorbing nutrients or providing coastal defence. Supporting services such as supporting species of conservation importance or just generally species richness, and cultural services such as well-being and sort of learning and inspiration and maybe even spiritual connection. So some work that we've done recently is estimated that actually the realized value of kelp forests is about 33 billion US dollars per year to the global economy. So really quite important. I'm just going to highlight one of these ecosystem services because it's quite pertinent to the last part of what I'm going to be talking about. And this is coastal protection during storminess. And just to go into a little bit more depth here, this is a huge body of work that a consortium of us undertook over 2 years ago. It's currently in review in a journal as we speak. And we did a desk-based study looking at all the literature to see the evidence space for supporting these different ecosystem services. And I think the important thing with this coastal protection from storminess is that actually there's probably less than 10% of studies show that actually this ecosystem service is present, but about 50% or just under 50% suggest that it's likely present, but the information is unknown. And we can see that big white spot that again is just under 50%, where we just don't know whether kelp forests provide that coastal protection. And we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end, so just keep that in your mind. Anyway, hopefully, it's a little bit hard when it's a webinar, and I don't get eye contact, but hopefully, my enthusiasm has demonstrated to you that kelp forests are really important. But, if you don't want to believe me, I totally understand. But perhaps you might want to believe Charles Darwin. And this is a quote from his Voyage on the Beagle, where he said that he could only compare these great aquatic forests of the southern hemisphere with the terrestrial ones in the intertropical regions. He went on to say that I do not believe nearly so many species of animals would perish as would here from the destruction of kelp. So Darwin, as well as being interested in barnacles and finches, also rated kelp as well. But if Charles Darwin isn't the person that you particularly like as your source of natural history information, perhaps David Attenborough is yours. And this is a quote that he gave to the Times in 2018 as part of the Sussex bylaw, where they wanted to reduce trawling to try and bring back. And he again goes on about the importance of kelp forests for supporting really high levels of diversity. He talks about fish and cod being important, also how they're culturally important. And he also talks about the role of carbon storage as well. So he goes on to say it's imperative that we protect our kelp forests. And indeed, some of you may have seen his latest movie, Ocean, and there was an accompanying book with that, of which there is a chapter on kelp forests in there. So, moving to the UK, and I don't want you to get bogged down with these numbers. These are the real numbers, but they probably don't mean very much if you don't compare them against something. But in essence, if you look at the circles, what we can see is two different species here. Laminaria hyperborea, which we find on our most exposed coastlines, and Saccharina latissima that we find in more sheltered locations, is also the species that we probably use in seaweed aquaculture the most. So it's estimated that UK kelp is estimated to occupy about 5,700 square kilometres. But what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? So what it does mean is that kelp covers a 13 times greater area than salt marsh and 67 times greater area than seagrass meadows. So it really is our largest marine vegetated habitat. And yet we probably know not as much about it, and we probably have fewer conservation designations for kelp forest than we do for these other two marine vegetated habitats. And like all natural systems, kelp forests are exposed to a range of different stresses, from warming to heat waves, storms, species invasion, overharvesting. And when I was doing a postdoc in Western Australia, and then I came back to the UK in 2011. And one of the people that I met out in Western Australia, Dan Smale, the person in this image here, he's now at the Marine Biological Association. We decided that we quite liked each other's company, we'd quite like to work together, and we then decided what were we going to work on. So we did some work to show that while in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the UK was really quite a leader in the study of kelp forests. In the 70s and 80s, that had really decreased to the point where actually we were a really insignificant player in this area, and yet we support really substantial kelp forests. We also were both interested in the impacts of climate change, and the cool thing is there's about a 2-degree difference between the north and western Scotland and the south of Wales and southwest England. So we could do these space for time comparisons, where the kelp forests of the southwest of the UK are perhaps more what we might expect in 2100 in the north of Scotland. So we began this really large campaign of doing huge amounts of field work around 4 locations around the UK. I think we've collected over 10 years worth of data. I think we've had 5 or 6 PhD students go through our groups just working on this stuff. And I think we've published about 30 papers just based on this work, and actually all on a relative shoestring in terms of funding. I'm not going to talk about any of this because I don't want to bore you too much. And as you can see, we spent greater than 300 hours underwater, so I could probably talk a very long time about this. But what I just want to get across to you is while a lot of UK a lot of global kelp forests are threatened, is that actually in the UK we've got a pretty healthy kelp population. And that's in part because most of the kelp species are at the centre of their range. They're not being impacted overly by temperature rise just yet. They're also generally on exposed coastlines, so there's less human interference. So we can see here that that over 10 years of data, we've got, some interannual fluctuations, but in general, the sort of number of individuals, the density of them, their percent cover, and their biomass or standing stock stays relatively the same. So I want to sort of pivot the talk now towards the more the stronger shores part of the project. But I guess what I wanted to get across that kelp forests are really important habitats, and from a UK perspective, they're actually in relatively healthy conditions. So actually, what can we use them as a nature-based solution and perhaps make protect what we've got because of those nature-based solutions where we have got losses or we are putting in hard infrastructure, can we perhaps utilize kelp for added benefits? So I'm going to pivot towards the Stronger Shores project now that I'm involved in, and I'm very much going to be presenting some PhD students' work. So we know that erosion and flooding is occurring across coastlines globally. Some of this, obviously, erosion and flooding are natural processes. They've been going on for millennia, but climate change is leading to sea level rise and increased storminess that is driven by humans. So they're making our coastlines and the infrastructure around coastlines more vulnerable. Historically, we've used a lot of hard coastal defence infrastructure, but these are not very environmentally friendly, and they can be costly. So can we actually be using our natural systems to help protect our coastlines? And the idea being is this is a simulated kelp forest here, is that because of this three-dimensional structure, is that actually you've got this initial wave energy, and then because of the drag that's created, you've got this inertial loss, you've got drag loss, and you've got turbulence loss. So the waves get smaller the closer you get to the shore, which is facilitated by these kelp forests. So this is all good in theory. This is something that I've been writing in papers for years, saying the role that kelp forests play in coastal defence. But if you think that slide a little bit earlier, is that you can see that actually the evidence base to underpin it is not really there. So when the Stronger Shores project first came around and we were invited, Newcastle University was invited on board, is that we very much said that actually we need to provide this evidence base. And actually, DEFRA, the Environment Agency, and South Tyneside Council, who are the grant awardees, they were very open to the idea that we actually created this evidence base. So I'm just going to talk through some work that was led by Jack Duffy, and his research is very much making use of creating mimics. So far he's created kelp mimics. He's also going to go on to create oyster mimics and then seagrass mimics, and then he puts those into university wave tanks and looks at how that reduces wave energy. So Jack's a great guy, but he's a physicist. So instead of calling that a live kelp, he calls that his prototype. And then he created a model kelp. So this is Jack here. He's a very intelligent guy. His background is I think he did his undergraduate degree in physics and he did a master's in marine biology. I'm not going to present any of the physics here because I don't understand it. All I can tell you is that Jack took a whole load of measurements from the prototype. He then used various engineering tools on the university campus to make sure that they had the same tensile strength, that there was same material, that there was same bendiness. And it was remarkable how accurately he was able to do this. It really was quite impressive. But what we've got here is an image in the top right of a natural kelp forest, and this is Jack's model kelp forest. So this is in a wave tank, and I think what hopefully you can all agree is that it's pretty impressive the way that it's actually modeled the way that the kelp moves in his model compared to what it is in real life. There are some slight issues in that the blades stick together, but we've sorted that using uh, well, if you're a diver, it's what you use to help get your dry suit on. But actually, it turns out it's primarily used as veterinary lubricant and is considerably cheaper if you buy it as veterinary lubricant. But it's a water-based thing that stops the fronds sticking together. Anyway, what Jack then went on to do is he went on and used a big wave tank down in Bangor in North Wales. And what we can see here is you can see the propagation of the wave from the right-hand side leading to the left-hand side. And just visually, you can see actually how that wave has decreased through that time along there. So even without doing any measurements, and he had lots of sensors, I hope you can see that actually that propagation of the wave reduced as you went through the kelp forest. So I'm now going to provide a series of graphs. Do not get worried about the numbers on here or anything like this. Essentially, on the x-axis on the bottom, that is just the distance along that wave tank. And the y-axis, don't worry about the numbers, but the lower the number, the more that wave energy is attenuated. So this is an image of essentially the wave tank. And this is when there's nothing in there. So unsurprisingly, you create a big wave at the beginning. It will slow down over time. Okay, so you can see a slight decrease over time. Okay, we can then do kelp at low density, and you can see that that line becomes a bit more of a slope, but not too different from when you've got nothing in there. But now when we get medium density kelp, you can see that real reduction in wave energy. And then when you look at high density kelp, you can see that that wave energy is really, really reduced compared to having no kelp there whatsoever. And Jack is only finished this work just before Christmas, but he's got some immediate sort of results. So in essence, the 22 centimeters is the amount of wave height above the surface. In essence, it replicates what you would have is sort of just before low tide conditions. So what he's calculated is that where you've got a high density kelp forest, you would need a sort of a kelp forest band of between 9 to 18 meters to see a 50% reduction in wave height. In a low density environment, you would need to have a kelp forest that was between 56 and 208 meters long to see a reduction by 50%. And so what I hope you can tell from this is that actually we're starting to provide that evidence base that actually kelp forests do attenuate wave energy. Of course, this is impacted by the density of the kelp, which isn't a surprise, and also the amount of water above the kelp forest. We're currently now going into doing this work in situ as well, where we're actually putting wave loggers out to sea. And Robin, one of the other PhD students, is working on developing some cheap sensors. The sensors that we primarily use cost between 10,000 and 20,000 pounds a shot. I'm slightly nervous. We're going down to Plymouth next week to deploy them in Plymouth in really stormy conditions. I'm a little bit worried they might disappear. But she's developing ones that will be £300 a pop, which you get less stressed about if they disappear. But also it means we'll be able to deploy these at loads and loads of locations around the country. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening. I hope that you've taken from this that kelp forests, well, are really abundant, pretty healthy in the UK, and they actually um, have really important ecosystem services that they provide human society, including an increasing evidence base that they actually help reduce wave action and perhaps the impacts of storms on our coastline. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
That was absolutely magic. Thank you very much for that, Pip. That was fascinating. So I'm gonna open up to questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function, pop your questions into the webinar chat, folks, or just raise your hand if you want to talk yourself. But I am gonna start off with my own question, actually, if that's all right, Pip, since I've got
Yeah.
control of the room. So just wondering, looking at Jack's work there, it looked very much like he was mimicking the sort of those laminoids that you were talking about, the Laminaria species. Is he looking at any other kelp species, or is it just that one particular one because it likes those exposed areas?
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, he is just looking at that particular one because it's our most dominant kelp species. Our next most dominant one is one that actually we would call it a prostrate species. It just sort of goes across the floor of the seabed, so it's unlikely to have such a strong role in terms of wave attenuation. But we've got a number of different species that have a similar morphology around our coastline that will operate exactly the same.
Magic, thank you for that one. So I'm going to open up first of all to the Q&A section. So our first question comes from Susanna, who's asking, how long can kelp be out of the water before they start to die off?
Okay, so I mean, usually they're found at the very low tide or subtidal. So more often than not, they're not exposed to air. So generally they would be exposed to air for about 3 to 4 days every 2 weeks during the big spring low tides. So you sometimes find them a little bit higher in rock pools and things like that, but generally they're at the very low shore.
Perfect. And we've got one in the chat here, just someone asking, does kelp need a rock base to grow? Is there any other substrates that they can grow on top of?
Yeah, I mean, so naturally they would occur on bedrock or sometimes bouldery shores. If you think about seaweed aquaculture, that's usually on lines. I would imagine that if you're someone who is, an offshore wind operator or you're got buoyage in the sea, you will say that kelp is an irritant because it fouls your structures. So it will grow on any sort of hard substrate. You just won't find it in a sandy environment, or if I mean you sometimes do find it in sand where it's being buried, but it's got bedrock underneath. Yeah.
Perfect. And just building on that question, I suppose, I've got one here from Penny asking, how far offshore does kelp grow and how far below the surface can it extend down to?
Yeah, so obviously, as a photosynthetic organism, it needs light to grow. So around the UK, on the offshore islands such as St Kilda or North Rona or places like that, you might get kelp at 50 meters depth. Sort of the clear waters that you might find around Orkney, it is probably 25 meters depth. Around sort of much of the English coastline and Welsh coastline. You're sort of looking at not much more than 10 to 15 meters below sea level. So in terms of how far it extends out to sea, is very much dependent on how quickly the shore shelves off into deeper waters. But in some parts of the world, in the Mediterranean, you can get kelp at sort of 60 to 80 meters. And there is indeed kelp forests off Brazil at about 120 meters. They're just really clear, nutrient poor waters that mean that they still get enough light at that depth, which is pretty amazing, really.
Absolutely. And we've got a question here from Leo, which is actually, I suppose, something that's a bit pertinent to the Stronger Shores project itself. So they're asking, what are the ways that you can increase the density or the size of kelp forests? And also, do you have a favorite type of kelp?
I would say my favorite type of kelp is Laminaria hyperborea, which is the dominant one, the one in the picture behind us. I think it probably is the most important in terms, or probably the most valuable in terms of the ecosystem services it provides. It's also probably the one that I've swam around the most. Um, and I mean, what we find, Leo, is that actually where you've got a good environment, you've got high densities of kelp. So the densities of kelp that Jack used in that experiment is that high density kelp is what we find in most areas where you've got exposed coastlines, a fair amount of light, and so you pretty easily find it at that sort of density. Um, there are ways that I mean, I get asked by people all the time how to do this. In terms of thinking about wave attenuation, it could be something that you actually decided instead of putting a hard coastal defense structure on the shoreline, is it could be that you put some artificial reef down under the water and then seeded it with kelp. And then you've got this wave attenuation that's under the water, so it's not a visible eyesore sort of thing, but it's also providing other ecosystem services. So we also do some restoration work, not so much because we need it in the UK, but as a sort of proof of concept in case we need it into the future and for sort of eco-engineering purposes. If you're going to put hard structures into the marine environment, you might as well make them better for nature.
Quite right, absolutely. And touching on that, actually, we've got a question from Cora here, who's based in Alnmouth, and where they're having issues with coastal erosion. So Cora's asking, you just mentioned about that sort of seeding the kelp there. Is it possible to grow kelp forest manually off the coasts, and has it been done before?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, in terms of growing, yes, there is really brilliant examples going back hundreds of years in Japan where Japanese fishermen have restored kelp forests. They have I can't remember the actual word now, but they've got this warm water current that periodically kills off the kelp. The fishermen back 600 years ago knew that kelp was important for fisheries, so they would restore those kelp forests. So we've farmed and restored kelp forests for hundreds of years, particularly in Asia. You're seeing increasing seaweed aquaculture, and you're also seeing in other parts of the world restoration projects where you've seen the loss of kelp for various reasons. In the UK, we don't really have any examples of non-proof of concept restoration, but we do lots of proof of concept stuff. We grow kelp. Half my team is growing baby kelp half the time. Um, it is something that you could do. I guess the question that you would have to ask, and I was having this debate with a colleague the other day, because we've written a paper where you say where you might lose kelp in terms of um, climate change is that you could restore it in areas that are sandy by putting hard substrate down. Now, what I would say is, well, sandy habitats might not be as exciting as kelp, but they still a natural environment that support species. I guess the question we've got to ask when we're talking about protecting coastal infrastructure is if the decision is to put in some sort of defense structure to protect that coastal habitat, could you use kelp and artificial structures to help do that? And I would say that actually the answer to that is yes.
Magic. I've got an interesting one here from Leslie as well, asking what impact do you think commercial kelp forests would have on biodiversity? So going back to a little bit about you're talking about Japan there, got quite a lot of commercial. I suppose around the UK it's starting to build up a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we think that seaweed aquaculture in Europe is increasing by 30% year on year, really. So I think that's a really important question. Seaweed aquaculture is often held up as a really good new solution. It's low input. We don't add fertilizer to it. Um, it's offshore, so it's not competing with land use. Although I would argue that fishermen probably think differently in terms of how much of the sea is being taken up with various things. I think we do have to be careful about that. Most of the UK kelp forests are relatively small in scale, but there probably are concerns about competition for nutrients if you really scale up these kelp farms. You can see them from space off China, for instance. That competes with phytoplankton for the nutrients, and then of course phytoplankton, the very bottom of the food chain. We know that they provide habitat for other species and can provide more habit, well, can support more species than natural kelp forests in some regards because of the density in which they're farmed. But some of those are invasive species. They support fish, but different fish. And of course, you harvest that kelp, so it's only there periodically. So there is some discussion about sort of almost grazing or taking some but leaving some behind and things like that. But I think that's a really important question as seaweed aquaculture increases in the UK and in Europe.
Magic. I'm going to combine these two questions here, actually. So I've got one from Janet and one from Leonie here. So Leonie's asking how much of the kelp plants are left in winter to attenuate the effects of the storms. Then Janet goes on to ask how quickly does it grow? Because I'm guessing it'll need to replenish itself after those winter storms every year.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, many of you might remember Storm Arwen that hit, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago? And we had done some surveys during the summer before, and then we went out to do some surveys after Storm Arwen. I can look just around where I live, and to this day, there are still trees that you know you can see the devastation of where those trees got knocked down because of the power. Um, we sampled a number of shores on the Farne Islands and a number of shores around St. Abbs, and we saw no change in density in the kelp forest following Storm Arwen, apart from at one shore that was directly exposed to the northerly winds, Petticoat Wick, which is by St. Abbs. So actually, these are really resilient to storm events. I know we see lots and lots of kelp washed onto our shores, but I think that's because we've just got so much kelp. And so actually, you don't see a change in density. And what's really interesting is that this kelp species behind you in this image here, it can grow up to 18 years old. And we know it can do that because a bit like a tree, it has a growth season and then it doesn't grow. And so you can chop it, take a section of it, hold it up to the sunlight and count its growth rings. And so what we know is that it can grow for it live for quite a long time. More importantly, when I go and do surveys and I can have 3 meter high kelp forest at the canopy, I can take the sub canopy, which might only be 1.5 meters, and I age those, and they're exactly the same age as the big canopy formers, and they're just waiting there for, like in a rainforest, they're waiting there for a storm to take out the big ones so that they can grow. And they can grow sort of during their growth season, which is sort of late winter into spring, up to 3 centimeters a week. So they grow quite quickly.
Perfect. I apologize. You're getting lots of questions here, so
That's
we're
all right.
really testing your knowledge. But
I'm
it's
an
nice.
academic. I love the sound of my own voice.
Well, it's nice to see Kelp getting so much love just now. So it is. So we've got a question here from Susanna, which feeds in quite nicely again to that kind of that stronger shores, looking at coastal erosion, our coast moving a little bit more inland there, that sea level rise as well. So from Susanna, might our kelp forests come under threat? Oh, that's the wrong question that I was looking at there. There it is. It's from Penny, sorry. With the prospect of rising sea levels, how easy would it be for kelp to colonize newly flooded areas?
Yeah, I mean, there is this concept of coastal squeeze. We probably hear more about it with salt marsh, where you've got sea level rise, and actually species will be able to keep pace with some of that sea level rise. But then it could come up against something like a cliff or a cedar fence or something that means it can't move any further up. I mean, I guess as a low shore species, kelp's probably got a fair amount of distance to go up the shore. So I probably wouldn't be too worried about that to begin with.
Magic. Another one from Leonie here asking, do you have any data on the effects of kelp moderating ocean acidification and facilitating the growth of bivalves? So two different questions there, but maybe if you focus on the acidification side there.
Yeah, I think they're probably linked. The idea being that bivalves can be impacted by ocean acidification, and therefore growing them with kelp can. My understanding, it's not really my subject area, but my understanding is that there's evidence that they can reduce the impacts of ocean acidification. I would probably think it's probably over a relatively small spatial scale. I do know that a lot of seaweed farms are also mixed mussel farms as well. And So there is the potential that it could have beneficial impacts. I guess I would think that it's probably more of something we need to worry about in upwelling areas, so like along the Californian coast where they do see die-offs of oysters and things like that because of elevated CO2 in the water leading to acidification. Probably, I- um, my personal feeling is that ocean acidification is probably a concern for the far future. And if we don't get CO2 emissions under control, before that, temperature's going to have mucked everything up before OA starts actually really playing a role in a UK system.
Absolutely, thank you. Going to move over to the chat there. I've just seen a question here from Kathleen asking, what's the next stage of the project? I'm assuming Stronger Shores project there, once you prove that kelp helps with coastal protection.
Yeah, I think Jack's work shows really nicely in a wave flume tank in very controlled conditions that it has a role in attenuating wave energy. The next stage is the sort of work that Robin's doing. So in the field, and I guess what you have in the field is that you not only have kelp, but that kelp is growing on bedrock, which is also can be, quite three-dimensionally structured. So actually, you then add a complication there. We can deal with that, but if you've got that three-dimensional structure of the bedrock, is the kelp adding much more, or is the rock doing most of it, and things like that? So I think we've still got quite a lot to look at with that. We've got to look around the country. I think different densities of kelp. I think also the work that Jack did didn't have epiphytes on the kelp, and that's probably going to attenuate some wave energy as well. So I think there's a few more years of study in this yet, I think. I guess the other thing is actually looking at the role of seaweed aquaculture. So as part of the Stronger Shores project, the wildlife Durham Wildlife Trust, working with Seagrown, that Seagrown have created this. It's an unfortunate word, kelpido, but these are sort of modular kelp growing systems. And actually, they're at the surface of the water. I could imagine those being used quite effectively to attenuate energy in different configurations and things like that. So I think there's still quite a lot of work to do in this area.
Perfect. And just go back to you were talking about Jack and the other PhD's work there. A question from Alison, who you might know the answer to this one. It might be a Jack question, but how would the artificial kelp be fastened to the wave tank, the base of the wave tank there?
Yeah, I believe he screwed them in. So he's got this sort of hold fast, and then I think he used like little battens to screw them in. I think, if I'm right, he made over 650 artificial kelp and battened them in. It was it was quite a huge undertaking, and I believe he made the blades by putting them onto a sheet and then using a hairdryer to push the material down, so you had a thicker bit at the base and a thinner bit at the top of the blades where the digits are, just like you have in a kelp forest. It's really rather cool. Should get him and do his talk about how he built them. They're very good.
I'll be getting him in soon enough, I'm sure. Absolutely. But he's sick of the sight of kelp after 650 odd of those.
How could you, Blair, ever be sick at the sight of kelp,
Sad,
mate?
sad. Going off that topic there again, another one from Suzanne asking, how strong is the stipe in physical terms? So I know that your laminoids, some are more snappable, some are more bendy. Does it take a lot of effort to sort of break those stipes?
Yeah, it certainly can do. I've struggled at times when I'm trying to cut them in half to get rid of them after I've measured them. Again, I mean, I don't know the actual values. Jack would be able to provide that for you. Probably if I dug through his talk. But yeah, I mean, they're very bendy, and they do take a bit of effort. Certainly when you're at 25 meters trying to get them off the rock in Orkney, it can be quite frustrating.
I can believe that one, absolutely. I've got a different little tack here, but a nice question actually from Dorinda, who's based at Durham Wildlife Trust. So Dee's asking, are there any opportunities for people in the Northeast to get involved in citizen science activities related to kelp? So I don't know if you're aware of any going on.
I mean, so I get to plug something else now.
Far away.
I mean, obviously there are citizen science activities that are being run out of the Stronger Shores project, and Blair and his team do an awful lot of work there. I'm actually based at the Dove Marine Laboratory in Cullercoats, which is part of Newcastle University. We're just in the process. We're in the development phase of a National Lottery Heritage Fund proposal, where actually we're wanting to create an education and outreach program. And I'm sort of co-leader of that, along with Heather Sugden, who's also a collaborator on the Stronger Shores project. It's all about co-creating science, so we want people to be doing stuff that they want to do, but I can be quite persuasive, so I'm sure that there's stuff you can get involved in. There's also plenty of stuff going on in the lab, so there's stuff if you wanted to get involved in projects, you'd be welcome to. And we're also open on heritage days and things like that does that sort of thing. But watch this space. If we're successful with our National Lottery Heritage Fund proposal, we'll be doing lots and stuff in that space.
Oh, marvelous. So I'm aware that we're now at that sort of at 8 o'clock mark. Are you all right to stick about for say two more questions, Pip?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. I'll save the easiest one for you for last there. We've got a question here from Susanna asking, might our kelp forests come under threat from promotion as gardeners and agricultural fertilizer? So is there a risk of us extracting too much of that in terms of agriculture there for fed?
Yeah, I mean, some people may remember, oh, it's probably getting on for 10 years ago now. There was a proposal to wild harvest kelp up in Scotland. Now, there is some wild harvesting of seaweeds, primarily over small amounts for consumption. Most of what we consume is grown. Um, and what happened with this discussion about wild harvesting, it was thought it could be an alternative source of income for fishermen. So they could, pot or trawl, but then they could also harvest kelp. There was a huge amount of outroar. Twitter, when Twitter was still good, went berserk. There was loads of arguments against it, and it pretty much died in Scotland, and I don't see it rearing its head again. In terms of using it for fertilizers and things like that, that's one of the uses from seaweed aquaculture. And in terms of seaweed aquaculture, one of the things that's probably slowing down its expansion is that fertilizer is relatively cheap, and people want to make higher value products out of it, such as bioplastics or biofuels or things like that. So I wouldn't worry about putting seaweed extract on your tomatoes next summer.
Magic, thank you. Interesting one actually from Neil, which I don't know if I know the answer to this one, but is there any such thing as a kelp that can survive in fresh water? Is there any freshwater kelps?
No, no.
Purely
I mean,
marine.
you've got things like Saccharina latissima that will grow in more estuarine environments, but
Mhm.
but but no, not really. There's plenty of algae that does grow in fresh water, but nothing we would call kelp.
Magic. And two more. So Daniel asking, how does kelp propagate itself, and are there factors affecting this? So how does it actually reproduce and extend? So you mentioned in your talk a little bit about that
Yeah,
life
so
that goes through.
if you're on the beach ever, and I would really recommend, I've noticed that someone said thank you when they were watching with their 8-year-old son. If Cora's still there, like, and your son is, when you see kelp washed up on the shore, rip it to bits. You can look in the holdfast, you can see gribblers in there. But also if you hold the blade up to the light, you can sometimes see that there's a slightly dark material, looks a bit like a splodge on there. That's what we would call the sorus tissue. And that's the reproductive bit. So what they do is they release that into the marine environment. Then that becomes the gametophyte. That's a diploid stage, so they need a sperm and egg to meet. Then and in the gametophyte stage, that then creates a haploid sporophyte, which we see. So it's if you think back to your genetics from school and things like that, this is an asexual stage that you've got here. Probably don't use that word anymore. But so One of the things that would limit it is that actually they're not very motile. They don't drift very far. So if we do some population genetics, we can see population structuring over just a few kilometers. So for instance, if you remove kelp from an area and it's further than say 10 kilometers to the nearest healthy kelp, it's going to be hard for it to recover. Just very quickly is that a lot of this coastline, the sort of Durham coastline, was absolutely devoid of kelp forest because of all the coal waste that was dumped on it. When I first moved to Newcastle in 2020, I was asked by the Durham Heritage Coast if we would restore kelp down at Easington. It was all during COVID time. We walked down when we were allowed to actually go out and about. We didn't need to restore the kelp, it had recovered naturally. So, there can be some good news stories as long as there's a healthy population relatively nearby, they can recover.
They're a hardy species, so they're grand, so they are. So our final question comes from Nicola, a nice and easy one to wrap things up. What is your favorite limpet if the blue raid is your
Ah, I'm
favorite?
glad someone
There
asked that question.
you go.
I did my PhD in Southwest England, and I did an awful lot of work where I stuck small numbers to limpets and tracked them for 2 years or more. But my favorite limpet is Patella depressa, which is the black-footed limpet. It's a southern species of limpet that has a distribution from Morocco up to North Wales. And I'm a sad anorak. That means that I can look at limpets on the shore and tell the difference between the common limpet and that limpet really quite easily. But most people can't because it's a real anorak skill to have.
Oh, Pip, we've got our shore searches coming up in April. Gonna need to get you out to come
None
and do
up
a bit
here,
of rock
man.
roll with
It's
us.
species four. All I can. Oh, Patella vulgata.
There's nothing wrong with a bit of that common limpet. All right, so that is the end of our questions there. But Pip, I just want to say a massive thank you very much for giving up your time and speaking to us tonight, because that has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you so, so much there.
No worries,
And
Blair. Thanks for inviting me.
it's been a total pleasure. And a huge thank you to everyone else for coming along and listening in tonight as well. We've got our next talk, same time again next week. And I might get this wrong. No, I'm right. It is oysters next week we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be joined by the Wild Oyster Project. So again, Tuesday night, 7 till 8 p.m. Details will be on social media, or if you have a look at the Durham Wildlife Trust event page as well, you'll be able to find out more there. So I'd just like to, yeah, thank you. And I'm going to pop in a little poll here if anyone has a time just to give us a little bit of feedback on that talk. So feel free to stick around and answer that, or if you've got things to do, head on off. But again, huge thank you, Pip. I will let you head on off and have a wonderful evening. Thanks again.
Cheers. Thank you. Cheers, guys.
Bye for now.